MIP Gospel Choir for their amazing performance. And good evening. My name is Daniel Elston, a student at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and lead mentor for the Blazer Male Excellence Network. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight Reverend Dr. William J. Barber. Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II is the president and senior lecturer of Repairs of the Breach, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, bishop with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, and senior fellow at Auburn Seminary. For more than a quarter century, he has pastored the Greenleaf Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, in Goldsboro, North Carolina. Since Reverend Dr. Barber began his ministry at Greenleaf 29 years ago, the church has sponsored efforts that have led to more than $12 million of community development, in addition to welcoming all into the body of Christ. He is the author of 4 books: We Are Called to Be a Movement, Revive Us Again, Vision and Action in Moral Organizing, The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement, and Forward Together, A Moral Message for the Nation. Reverend Dr. Barber is also the architect of the Moral Movement, which began with weekly Moral Monday protests at the North Carolina General Assembly in 2013 and revived under the banner of the Poor People's Campaign. In 2018, Reverend Dr. Barber helped relaunch the Poor People's Campaign, which was begun by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others in 1968, with a historic wave of protests in state capitals and in Washington, D.C., calling for a moral agenda and a moral budget. Reverend Dr. Barber has been arrested more than 17 times for nonviolent civil disobedience. Millions of Americans have participated in Poor People's Campaign events over the past 3 years. Reverend Dr. Barber served as president of the North Carolina NAACP, the largest state conference in the South, from 2006 to 2017, and served on the National NAACP Board of Directors from 2008 to 2020. A former Mel King Fellow at MIT, he is currently visiting professor of public theology and activism at Union Theological Seminary and senior fellow at Auburn Seminary. Reverend Dr. Barber was named one of BET's 100 Entertainers and Innovators in 2020, and he is a 2019 recipient of the North Carolina Award, the state's highest civilian honor. Reverend Dr. Barber has also received the MacArthur Foundation Genius Award, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Award, the Martin Luther King Jr. Center's Beloved Community Award, and the Puffin Award. Without further ado, I welcome Reverend Dr. William Barber.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Birmingham. I want you all to give that young brother a big hand. If I get to the gate and have any problems, I'm going to call him, see if he can't have a conversation with St. Peter. You know that brother's majoring in neuroscience and philosophy. Neuroscience. If I was anywhere close to that, I'd be singing "Near My God to Thee." We thank God. Let me thank God tonight. Gracious God, for your mercy, your love, your power. We thank you for who you are. A mother to the motherless, a father to the fatherless, a friend to the friendless, sin forgiver, a justice declarer, and a way maker. We know you by many names, but we thank you for being holy, and beside you there is no other. Bless us as we move forward tonight. Amen. I want to thank everybody who had anything to do with us being invited to be with you at this gathering, from the University of Birmingham to the center across the street, anybody, to the members of the Poor People's Campaign in Alabama's Poor People's Campaign is just powerful. I see Carolyn Foster coming in the back. And all of you, all the poor people's campaign people, stand up so I can see where you are. If you're in any way connected, come on, give them up. Give it, amen. And to this powerful choir, thank you all. You know, they were singing salvation and glory. There's a scripture in the Bible in Romans 15 that says the kingdom of God is justice, peace, and joy in the Holy Ghost. There is no way to sing about salvation and glory and kingdom without talking about justice. I want you to get your cell phones out and text the word moral, M-O-R-A-L, to 38542. 38542. Text the word moral, M-O-R-A-L, to 38542. Text that number, text the word moral to the number 542, so you can be hooked up. And I want to ask the sound folk if they might give me a hand mic to Reverend Dr. Della, just in case I might need it. My knees are older than they used to be. And I'm here tonight. I had planned to, we just opened a new center for public policy and public theology at Yale, and I was there, and then I'm still pastoring I'm finishing up pastoring after 35 years, and we had a sudden death in our church, so instead of going from New Haven to Birmingham, I had to go to New Haven, back to Goldsboro to be with the family, and then come here tonight. So I indeed ask your prayers. I don't do Martin Luther King celebrations. I'm actually going across the country and advocating that we stop. What we should be doing is, I think, Martin Luther King re-engagements, reconsecrations, and recommitments. The truth of the matter is, this country loves, and most power structures love prophets in their tombs. Matthew 23, Jesus said, "Woe unto you who love the tombs of the prophets, but not the prophets when they are alive." And so if we really study the life of Dr. King, I think that I want to suggest tonight we can't be satisfied. And we must know without a shadow of a doubt, right now where we stand and live, we need a moral revival in our own time. Psalm 118, verse 22 says, there comes a time when the stone that the builders rejected become the chief cornerstones of a new reality. And when that happens, this is the day that the Lord makes. Hebrews chapter 10:39, which was a favorite passage of scripture of Dr. King, says, "We are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen." Tonight, this was billed as a lecture, and God knows we need some teaching in the midst of all the lies. One writer said, telling lies and telling the truth in a time of lies is revolutionary in and of itself. So I want to take a little moment and teach. First of all, I want us to you all are here in Birmingham, but just stop for a minute and just think about this space. This space. You know, the Birmingham campaign happened in spring of 63. And one of the reasons it was chosen because there was a time when Alabama was a great Union state. It was a great labor state. And the devotees of the Southern aristocracy and the segregation society couldn't stand that. That's why they worked so hard to break the Union relationship with black and white folk coming together. And so Martin King was here with others, Fred Shuttleworth and so many other male and women, children, Reverend Orange. My brother's sitting here tonight and reminding me of Reverend James Orange, my dear friend. And he was in the middle of this campaign. The governor had just said segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow, forever. The Birmingham campaign is going on. That's when Bayard Rustin contacts Dr. King and says, we think we need to do a march on Washington, but it doesn't need to be just a march on Washington. The original planning was to have a whole week of nonviolent civil disobedience, not just a day. And they called Dr. King and said, would he be in? He said yes. So did SNCC and SCLC. There was some struggle in the civil rights community about what needed to happen. There was some struggle all the way up to the president in this country at the time, Kennedy. And then the Birmingham campaign is successful. And right after the Birmingham campaign is successful, Medgar Evers is shot on the very night that John F. Kennedy gives a speech declaring that he's going to push the Civil Rights Act. And then there was the Detroit campaign before the March on Washington. People don't talk about that, where 100,000 people gathered several weeks before Washington, D.C. is actually where Dr. King gave I Have a Dream for the second time. The first time he did it was in 1962 in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. The closing I'm talking about. Then in Detroit he does it, and then the March on Washington happens. Julian Bond, in his book, though, A Time to Teach, says that by the time they got to the March on Washington, there had been a lot of compromises that Martin didn't agree with. No women would be allowed to speak. John Lewis's speech was cut. Martin was being pushed to be more professorial and not to be as rigid. There was even somebody, according to that book, A Time to Teach, standing beside the sound system where the plug was to pull the plug if the speeches got too radical. And Dr. King, in that speech, declares that we have to be against what he called the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Because he was frustrated, because he opens that speech and says, too often people focus on I Have a Dream, but the title of the speech was Normalcy Never Again. And he opens it by saying, 100 years later, the Negro said, he's lamenting that everything they were asking for in 1963 had already been done in 1868, 1869, 1870, 1872, and 1875. And he was lamenting that here we are going backwards. So 100 years later. And then 17 days after my birth, August 28, 1963, 16 days after the March on Washington, 4 girls were blown up in this church. The face of Jesus was blown out of the stained glass window in this church while they were studying in Sunday school about how to love your enemy. And the killer set off the bomb because he said, I bet you if I kill these children, they're going to stop all this marching and carrying on. And Dr. King comes here and preaches one of the eulogies. And in that eulogy, he talks about what those girls, those 4 girls, if any of the family members are here tonight, we honor you, had to say to us. And one of the things he said that those 4 girls had to say to us is to raise the question, not just who blew them up, but what blew them up. And he said every white politician that continues to give cover for racism did it. Every black preacher that stands in their pulpits and refuses to get involved in the movement did it. Oh, he went down a list, and he didn't pull any punches. And it was out of the deaths, though, instead of it scaring people away, students started saying, we've got to mobilize even deeper now. And then by November, the president was killed. So a governor starts off in January, February of '63 saying segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow, spewing that rhetoric, using rhetoric to launch more racism. And by November, Medgar is dead, 4 girls are dead, and a president is dead. Don't tell me that language isn't dangerous. Particularly political language that is said from political places that legitimizes extremism and hate. So here we are. And I just want to go read back through that history some to remind us of the sacredness of this space. But one of the things I struggle with, and I'm really kind of just talking out loud with you tonight, is how do you remember a martyr? First of all, you got to be careful not to sanitize their death. We're not here tonight for somebody that died, just died naturally. We're here for somebody who was shot with a deer rifle through the neck and severed his spine and killed him instantly. But why? Dr. King didn't simply lay down his life. He was assassinated at 39. The gunman took him from us. But why was Dr. King killed? He was killed because he decided to take up his cross and truly follow the Lord and follow the nonviolent way of love. See, today, a lot of folk want to bypass the cross and get to God. They want all the blessings. They love to get in the blessing line, but they don't want to get in the cross handing out line. But that's the line where power is, because Jesus said, if you're going to follow me, you must take up your cross. Dr. King had decided long before Memphis that he was willing to die challenging racism, poverty, and militarism. Some people say Dr. King started talking about economics in '68. No, he didn't. In 1958, in Dexter Avenue Church, he talked about how the 1% was overlording the 99%. At his lecture when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, he talked about the three evils of militarism and poverty and racism. This is 1964. In 1965, standing on the steps of the Alabama State House after the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, Dr. King said that the reason we have segregation and racial hatred and division is because the racist Southern aristocracy and their other colleagues around the world, their greatest fear is for the masses of Negroes and the masses of poor white people to come together and form a voting bloc that could fundamentally shift the economic architecture of a nation. He said that in '65. But if you think about why Dr. King was really killed, he wasn't killed because the citywide desegregation in Montgomery or in Birmingham or the desegregation of public schools. He wasn't killed because of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. No, he was killed because he wouldn't be satisfied. See, a lot of folks told him, look, you got the Civil Rights Act, you got the Voting Rights Act, just cool out. Go get your church, go be a professor and do some lecturing and stop all this. But Dr. King said, something's wrong. And we can't accept the military-industrial complex that will destroy lives half a way around the world, and then an economic system that's willing to throw away millions of people right here, and then the continuing reality of systemic policy-driven racism. So Dr. King was killed because he pledged an eternal dissatisfaction with injustice. He said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Before I left today, I was shocked when I left the hotel by a young man. And he said to me, so you're here to do the King thing tonight, right? And I said, well, I'm here to be with the brothers and sisters. He said, yeah, you just gonna do what everybody else do. You all celebrate Dr. King, and you don't even talk to people like us, who were the people he was with when he was killed. He said, when are they gonna let people like me speak? So when Dr. King died, he was with garbage workers. He was with garbage workers. And that's why he was killed, because he wouldn't be satisfied. His own staff had said to him, don't go down to Memphis. They just garbage workers. Did y'all invite the garbage workers here tonight in Birmingham? I'm just asking. I'm asking these questions everywhere. You know, are they featured in the programs of remembrance around Dr. King in Birmingham, in Montgomery, Selma, Alabama? Because let's not forget. 2 years after I Have a Dream, and why do we get stuck on I Have a Dream like that's the only thing Dr. King ever said? And if you know a little bit about black preaching, I Have a Dream was the hoop. I Have a Dream is what you do when you preach so much hard preaching, you got to at least lift the people up a little bit. But 2 years after that, he confessed at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta that the dream had often turned into a nightmare, and he couldn't be satisfied. He said, my dream has been shattered. It's been shattered. He said, wherever I go to Appalachia, the dream is shattered. I go to the urban area, the dream is shattered. I see too many of my white brothers, along with my Negro brothers and sisters, living in poverty. And 60 years since March on Washington, do you know the agenda that was the agenda for the March on Washington still has not been passed? You know they had an agenda. It wasn't like people didn't just come to hear Martin speak. There were 600 cities where people were engaged in nonviolent action all over the country. And this was the agenda. Number one, a full Civil Rights Act that would include voting rights. The reason we had to have a Voting Rights Act in 1965 is because voting rights was compromised out of the 64 Civil Rights Act because of the filibuster. So a full Civil Rights Act. The second thing they wanted was a $2 minimum wage, which would be $15 today. The same thing that Birmingham passed, and then the state of Alabama said you all couldn't do it. That was the agenda in 63. Health care, labor rights, and ending police brutality and racial violence through law enforcement. That was the agenda. And if you look at that agenda today, there's no way we can be satisfied. We still need a moral revival. Unemployed Americans remains depressingly similar. In 1963, we live in a high term of unemployment. In fact, on January 6th, while people were remembering what happened 2 years ago, there were some economists on CNBC, and economists that advise presidents and senators, and they were literally arguing that the way you end inflation is to create more unemployment. Who said that? Am I telling the truth? I come to teach tonight. They said that they were arguing that the way you end inflation is not to make the rich pay their fair share and reduce their ability to pump so much money into the economy and make it heat up, or the ability for corporations to stop producing things in order to drive the price up. Their solution to inflation today is to put more pain on the people already hurting. And here we are today with African American communities where the unemployment today remains twice as high as in the white community. We can't be satisfied. We can't remain silent. We can't have celebrations of Dr. King and talk about, oh, things are so much greater. That's not even the issue. I was somewhere the other day, and somebody said, well, Reverend Bob, at least we don't drink. You got to be happy about something. I said, what, happy? Yeah, sure. But that's not what we're talking about. When we say, what are the issues today, you don't then bring up, well, at least we're not drinking out of separate water fountains. That's two different conversations. Moral dissent is what we need today, that refuses to accept injustice. Now, it's political, but it's not an allegiance to any party. I didn't come here tonight to talk about Democrats, Republicans, because if we're going to honor Dr. King, we've got to reach down deeper than just political partisan arguments. We got to look at the moral ground. They can't hear me? Can y'all hear me? Okay. We got to be honest about where we really are. So I'm going to share some things with you that come from as a collaboration of some information from the Institute for Policy Studies, Jeffrey Sachs, one of the renowned economists, Joseph Stiglitz, a renowned economist, Bernie Sanders, the Poor People's Campaign audit. I want to lay out some things tonight. And I want to ask you as you hear these things, can we be satisfied? If we're going to truly honor Dr. King's memory, look at where we are first. On the one hand, Republicans in the House just spent a week or two unable to elect the Speaker, but even in the midst of that, they've attacked women, they've supported autocratic leadership, long before Trump. In fact, what we have found out is that Trump isn't even the problem, because Trump not even in office and they're still acting crazy. The problem is something that started 50 years ago in reaction to the civil rights movement called the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy in the 1960s, 66, 67, 68, Kevin Phillips designed it and taught it to Richard Nixon and said, if we want to win, we have to find out in politics who hates who and deliberately divide them. Positive polarization, they called it. And we use that division to gain political power. Now, it might get out of control, but if we do it right, we can control from Maryland all the way over to the Southwest, and we can even control enclaves in the North if we can pit people against one another who really need to be allies. Are we not seeing that today? Can we be satisfied? On the other hand, Democrats just spent 2 years in control of all three branches of the government, and yes, they did some good things, some important things, some things we supported under their leadership. They made some significant investments, but what you have to look at is how much had to be compromised to get a little bit. We've had compromise successes. And so you have an American Rescue Plan, but in order to pass it, you gotta say no to living wages, no to a full embrace of child tax credit, no to paid family leave, no to health care. So you can't really call it a full victory. It's kind of a compromised victory. You can't be satisfied. You got to look at all the things that, here we are sitting in here right now, tonight, and 52 senators, 50 Democrats, and 50 Republicans and 2 Democrats blocked 55 million Americans from getting a living wage. You can't be satisfied with that. 52 senators blocked 55 million people from getting a living wage of $15 an hour. Blocked paid family leave. Blocked it. In the middle of COVID, we called people who used to be called service workers, we changed their name to what? Essential workers. And we tooted horns about it and did resolutions about it. But they weren't essential enough to get a living wage, or get essential enough to have health care, or essential enough to have paid family leave. So many of them died caring for the rest of us. In the honor of Dr. King, we cannot be satisfied with that kind of governing. Here we are, right here in 2023, is it? And in America, there are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country right now. 140 million. 43% of the entire nation, 52% of all of our children are poor and or low wealth. 60.9% of black people are poor and or low wealth. That's over 26 million black people. 30% of white people are over poor and low wealth. That's 66 million white people are poor and or low wealth. And it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have scarcity. We don't have a scarcity of resources or a scarcity of policy, knowing what to do. We have a scarcity of moral consciousness. Who are we talking about? These essential workers, for instance, that we didn't give a living wage, that the very politicians who, when they get elected, they get living wages and they get free health care that we pay for. Many of them put their hands on Bibles and pray, P-R-A-Y, and after they finish praying, they pray, P-R-E-Y, on the very people that the Bible says we ought to be lifting up. We cannot be satisfied. Who are we talking about? Essential workers, nurses, bus drivers, meat packing workers, EMT staff, cops, firemen, teachers, grocery store workers. These are the people that we said you're essential, but we're going to treat you like you're expendable. And 52 senators could do that. We live in a time where billionaires during COVID made $2 trillion. And 68% of all the COVID relief money went to corporations. While the poor were dying at a rate of 3 to 5 times higher, not because COVID discriminated, but because of our deliverance of policy discriminated and deliverance of services discriminated. So poor people, just because they were poor, died at a rate 3 to 5 times higher than anybody else. 330,000 people have died during COVID, not from COVID, but because of the lack of health care. And we're the only country of the 25 wealthiest countries in the world that does not offer some form of paid family leave and health care in the 21st century. We can't be satisfied. And we can in no way use king, quote, celebrations to tranquilize us and think that everything has been done. While this is happening, multi-billionaires like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson, they were taking joyrides in outer space, living in mansions with 25 bathrooms, buying $500 million yachts, while people were dying. Right now, we're here today, 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half of the American society. 3 people own more wealth than 165 million people. And 400 families in this country make an average of $97,000 an hour. And if you go with low-wage workers and stand in front of a McDonald's or a Kentucky Fried Chicken demanding 15, they will lock you up. I know because I've been locked up 5 times. We can't be satisfied. 600 and some odd thousand people homeless every night, 2 to 3 million people living in shelters. 1%, the 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90% of all the American people. I went somewhere and was giving these numbers out, and they said, "Reverend Bob, you just won't be happy." I said, "Do you think Dr. King walked around happy all the time?" It's not about not being happy or being sad. It's about telling the truth and understanding that the only way you can honor a prophet is when they fall, you pick up the baton from there. Huh? That's the only way. We live in a time where over the past 48 years, according to a study done by the Rand Corporation, more than $50 trillion in wealth has been redistributed from the bottom up. In other words, money, there's plenty of money, but the redistribution of money is going from the bottom up rather from the corporate leaders down. 63% of workers live paycheck to paycheck to paycheck to paycheck. What does this mean? It means people being afraid of their car breaking down, the kid getting sick, the landlord raising the price. Right here in Alabama, nearly 50% of all Alabamians are poor and low wealth. 51% of all Alabamians make less than living wage, and over 400,000 Alabamians, notice I'm not saying black either. Y'all notice that tonight? Deliberately doing that. Over 400,000 Alabamians don't have health care. The majority of them are white, and Alabama has refused to even accept Medicaid expansion. There's not a county in this country where a person working a minimum wage job of $7.25 that they can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. And the government measurement for poverty says today, Dr. King was fighting against this and it still hasn't been changed. They say today if you make $12,000 a year, you're not poor. Who said damn, even in the church? I heard that. Because I was thinking about saying it, but I thought you, but since you said it, you're right, damn. And by the way, they say most folk making a minimum wage are students, so they don't need it anyway. Say, students don't need a living wage. Y'all don't need 15, do you? See? Oh, and by the way, the tip system grew out of post-slavery America, when the former slave owners didn't want to pay black women. So they came up with a tip system and said, we'll tip you if we want to and if we don't. So today, restaurant workers, people working in hospitality, in the tip industry, you know what their minimum wage is by law? $2.13 an hour. By law! Can't be satisfied. And where does this come from? Two things: neoliberal economics and trickle-down economics. Now, neoliberalism basically says if you just take care of the middle class, then everybody else is okay. Trickle-down says if you put everything at the top, it'll flow down. Pope Francis calls both of these evil. He says they're unjust at their roots because they worship the market economy and they treat people like things. And it doesn't follow. Jesus said you got to lift from the bottom. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick, did you visit me? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. The word poor is a Greek word, patokos, P-T-C-H-O-S, which means those who've been made poor because of economic exploitation, not because they are lazy. Here we are today. 87 million people are either uninsured or underinsured. 87 million people. 68,000 people die every year from not having health care. 10 people died from vaping, and we had a congressional hearing and presidential White House visits. 68,000 people died from the lack of health care, and you barely hear one news story on that, because most of the news is controlled by the corporate and conglomerates that control what comes on. 700 people die every day from poverty, according to the Mailman School of Public Policy. 250,000 people die every day from poverty. 250,000 people die every day, every year from poverty. A few of us as clergy had to repent a few years ago because we had been lying at funerals. I was one of them. People would die in our congregations. We would have a homegoing service. And we would put the best music out there, and then we would stand at the pulpit and say, God called them home. We were lying all the time. No, God didn't call them home. God welcomed them home, but God didn't call them home. They died because they were murdered by bad public policy. You say, Rimbaud, that's too harsh. Read your Bible. What does it say in Matthew? It says, there was a sound of weeping in Ramah, Rachel crying and mourning because her children were no more. We are not supposed to be satisfied when policies are destroying people's lives. America is going to have to answer this question. America is going to have to decide whether or not death is going to still be okay as long as it's not killing you. Here we are, remembering Dr. King, but being the only international country of our size that doesn't guarantee paid family leave and medical leave and paid 6 days or paid vacation days or living wages. And none of this has to be. We lose money. Every time we allow child poverty, we lose millions of dollars. We lose $1.4 trillion when people don't have universal health care. When we block living wages, $15 living wage to every worker in this country, it blocked $330-some billion from being in this economy. You think Dr. King would be satisfied? Because, you know, when you think about $7.25, if that's the minimum wage, for black people, it took us 400 years to get to $7.25. So how much longer we got to wait now? Let me see, it's zero. Slavery was zero. So it took 400 years to get to $7.25. So what are we supposed to do? Wait another 400 years to get to 15? and when you talk like this, people say, but I thought Dr. King was about love. Well, he was. Love, he said, without justice is weak. And justice without love is abrasive. It's not justice or love or justice. Love will speak the truth. Love will tell you where your treasure is. That's where your heart is. Budgets are moral documents. Dr. King didn't get killed because he told folk to love. He got killed because he looked at policies and said, now you say you love God, but how does this policy line up with loving God? Because if you say you love God, but your policy hates your brother, how can you say you love God whom you've never seen? Listen to Dr. King. He said, we can't take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Listen what he said from Birmingham. I must confess. He said this in April 1963. From here, he was in jail. He said, I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. Moderate. Dr. King didn't like moderates. He said, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Those who say, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but slow down, calm down. Don't be so bothered. That's what Dr. King was writing from jail. And he also went on to write that in this moderation, white folk get hurt too. Did you hear that stat that I just said? 60.9% of all black people are poor and low wealth. That's 26 million black people. 30% of all white people are poor and low wealth. That's 66 million white people. In raw numbers, there are 40 million more poor and low wealth white people than there are poor and low wealth black people in raw numbers. In percentage, black people are 40% higher, 30% higher in terms of poverty within their race. Poverty, racism, ecological devastation, denial of health care, and the war economy hurts us all. Those are the 5 interlocking injustices that demand that we are no longer can be satisfied. If we truly honor Dr. King, we must move in our time and act to change those things, and we cannot be satisfied. You know, I was in Bessemer, Alabama. Who's from Bessemer? Told me they were from Bessemer. I came down to Bessemer when they were trying to, let me have my cane, when they were trying to unionize the plant over there. And, you know, old Jeff Bezos was fighting the people. You know what he did? In July, I think of 2020, he said, oh, I'm gonna give $5 million, I think $5 or $10 million to some civil rights organizations. Gave something to NAACP, gave something, and then 2 days later, he cut pay of his workers. But inside the plant, he had a big picture of him giving money to civil rights organizations, while at the same time, they were blocking the union. And the union vote didn't go well, but now they've gotten caught. And it's been proven that they wrongfully interfered with the union in Bessemer. So the people are gonna have to come back again. Don't you know Dr. King would be right in the middle of that fight in Bessemer if he was alive today? Fighting for people to have living wages, because Jeff Bezos cut hazard pay in the middle of COVID. And so what do we do with all of this? Well, Jürgen Moltmann said, real hope is when people of faith decide what is wrong is so wrong that they can no longer accept it, and they decide to, if necessary, suffer under it in order to change it. And so I come here tonight not just cursing the darkness, but the darkness must be cursed, but to say it doesn't have to be this way. We know what to do. And this is the agenda. If we're serious about Dr. King, we ought to be promoting everywhere. Number one, we need to update the poverty measure and establish a new basis for how we measure poverty and living wages in this country. We must destroy the lie that if you make $12,000 a year, you are not poor and low wealth. Number two, we must enact living wages and protect the right to form and join unions. Number three, we must have universal payer health care. You cannot, and especially down here in the Bible Belt, we got to start telling these folk that claim they love Jesus. Well, everywhere Jesus went, he healed folk and he never charged a copay. So come on now. We need to guarantee the right to housing. What Dr. King was talking about, the right to social uplift, the right to water, the right to an equitable, high-quality, well-funded, diverse public education. We need to relieve debts that cannot be paid. $5 billion in student debt that's unnecessary. Housing debt that people acquired during COVID, because what we did during COVID, we told people, this is what they passed. We will forgive your rent for 3 months, but in the fourth month, you got to pay the 3 months you couldn't pay before the fourth month. Somebody said that word again, I heard it. We must protect our democracy through expanding our voting rights and restoring the full power of the Voting Rights Act. It is a shame that we sit here tonight and we have less voting rights in America than we had August 6, 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was first passed, right after the march from Selma to Montgomery. We must establish national commissions to develop proposals on reparations, not just for African Americans, but for dispossessed people, including indigenous people. We must enact comprehensive and just immigration reform. It's time for us to stop saying that Latino people, for instance, are aliens. Texas was theirs first. California was theirs first. New Mexico was theirs first. We took it from them. They're not coming across the border. We went across the border. But it can't just apply to Latinos. It's got to apply to African people and Haitians and others who desire. Number 8, we've got to ensure the rights of Native and indigenous people. Number 9, we must embrace a bold climate agenda and a green economy. And since poor and low wealth and frontline communities get hurt first, then if we're going to put a lot of money in the green economy, then poor and low wealth people ought to be the first ones to get the businesses and the jobs that's going to be created by the new green economy. And then 10, we need to raise resources by making the wealthy pay their fair share. And at the very least, we ought to take 10% of our bloated military spending and put it toward programs that really work to lift up the lives of all people. And did you know that most Americans actually agree with this? They agree with this. They want living wage. They want health care. They want it. That's why there's so much work trying to divide us from their fear about immigrants and fear about gay people and fear about black people. All of this stuff is an attempt to keep people from each other who actually have the power, if they come together, to fundamentally shift this nation. And these tactics didn't start with Trump. They've been around for a long time. Read, if you will, Jonathan Shell's book, A Time of Illusion, and how he talked about the plans of division that were put in place. Read it and understand that what we see in terms of division is an old tactic. Yeah. That's why we have, as I close, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And that's why we're going all over the country organizing poor and low-wealth people and religious leaders and advocates, because it's time to come together. And not only must we come together, we've got to stop what I call the cordiality of accepting injustice. Don't y'all get mad with me, but I want to say something and then I'm through. You know, y'all got something down here called the Freedom Civil Rights Trail. And people come down here every year, come from Washington, D.C. They come right down here, sit in these pews, go across there to the Institute, and just finished voting against voting rights. They shouldn't be able to do that. They should at least get a nonviolent protest when they come. Y'all should at least challenge them. They shouldn't be allowed to come here and placate and act as though everything is okay. They shouldn't be able to walk across the Edmonds Pettus Bridge down here and then walk back voting rights up there. No. I got put out of the church down in Selma because the Secretary of State for Alabama was up at the podium on Sunday morning declaring that voter ID was an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. Voter ID is voter suppression. He was in the pulpit. And I heard, and a couple of us heard, and a couple of us, we didn't say amen, we said no. And the pastor asked us to leave. And he was lying. My brothers in Alabama, those of you that are on this civil rights trail, y'all got to stop this. You can't allow these folk to keep coming down here. This year, when they come to Selma, y'all ought to write it up right now and put it out on national TV. If you're a politician, don't come to Selma unless you're going to bring economic development to rebuild Selma before the tornado ever happened, and you're going to bring us a signed and fully restored Voting Rights Act and a living wage of $15 an hour. If you're not going to do that, don't come down here and think we're going to watch you talk about how you love the civil rights movement when in fact you love the folk that's dead. Right. Because dead prophets can't trouble you. And so, my brothers and sisters, we got to exercise our power. The three revivals we got to have. One is we got to revive and mobilize our voting power. God has fixed it so now that 30% of the electorate in this country is poor and low wealth. And in states where the margin of victory is within 3%, poor and low wealth people make up 45% of the electorate, which means if just 20% of poor and low wealth people and their allies who have not voted would vote, they could shift any elections in this country, even in Alabama. In Alabama in 2020, the number of poor and low wealth people that didn't vote was 1.9 million. The margin of victory wasn't but 300,000. So if just 25% of poor and low wealth voters were mobilized and talked to, and the number one reason poor and low wealth voters don't vote is because they say nobody talks to them. I've been from the Tenderloin in San Francisco to the Apache lands in Arizona to Appalachia in Kentucky, and the number one reason they say nobody talks to us. No presidential candidate runs and talks about how they're going to address poverty and low wealth, and we must change that. The sleeping giant in this country is poor and low wealth voters of every race, creed, and color, and their allies and religious leaders. Number two, we must revive our presence. What I mean by our presence, we got to understand that we can't stay away from these state legislators and the Congress. And so in June of this year, the Poor People's Campaign is going to sponsor our own Congress, a mass Poor People's Action Congress in D.C. I hope you all will come. I hope hundreds will come from Alabama. And then when we finish our conference, we're going on Capitol Hill. And at some point, we're going to start something where we're going to be there every day. If they arrest us every day, we're going to be there every day. Because we must revive our presence. We've got to put a face. We've got to make folks see the 87 million people without health care. We got to make them see the 250,000 people that are dying. We've got to make them see the 55 million people who are without a living wage. We've got to make them see the people, black, white, brown, students in rural areas and urban areas who are impacted because of voter suppression. They must see us. Look at your neighbor and say, make them hear you and make them see you. And then we've got to revive our protest pressure. And so, this past year in 2023, on June 18th, we called for a mass Poor People's Assembly, low-wage workers assembly, march on Washington and to the polls. Over 100,000 people showed up in person, 2 million online. Then we mobilized 7 million voters during this electorate. We just got the numbers back that said if poor and low-wealth people hadn't voted 13% higher than they did in the past election, there would have been a regressive wave. I won't call it a red wave, but it was sure enough regressive wave. And we mobilized, but it's not enough. So in 2024, we're going back to D.C. We're going for a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly, march on Washington and to the poll. But this time, we're not just going for a day. We're going for a period of time, and we need you. If you believe that America can do better, if you believe in the tradition of Dr. King that we can't be satisfied, then we need you to come join us. Dr. King, the last night he was with us, said these words: nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. And I just stopped by to tell you this final thing. The rejected are the key to the transformation. The Bible says the stones that the builders rejected can become a chief cornerstone in the building of a new reality. The people who've been rejected. And I just want to know, is there anybody in here that knows what it's like to be rejected? I wish a couple of y'all would just come with your mask on and stand beside me. If you know what it's like to be rejected because of your income, rejected because of your poverty, is there anybody rejected because of your race, rejected because of your sexuality? If you know what it's like to be rejected because of the way the skin color you were born in, or rejected because of your handicap, just stand with me, just one or two of y'all. If you know what it's like to be rejected because of your sexuality, because I want you to understand that the stones that the builders rejected, God is saying, and Dr. King was trying to tell us that these are the people. This is the reality. This is the revival. Come on up here. If you've been rejected in some way, I don't need but a few of y'all. It doesn't need but a remnant, because the rejected can transform people. And the truth of the matter is, when those who are Latino that have been rejected join hands with those that used to pick cotton, join hands with progressive white, join faith hands, join labor hand, join Asian hand, join native hand, join poor hands, join wealthy hand, join hands with a conscience, join gay hand, join straight hand, join trans hand. When we all join hands together, then we can transform this society. That's the legacy of Dr. King. Don't be satisfied. The rejected. How do I know, Barbara? How do you know? How do you know? Can I preach 3 minutes? Because the Bible tells me that when Moses and his rejected people got together, they used the rod. Pharaoh had to come down. When Esther and her uncle Mordecai, who had been rejected, got together, they stopped the destruction against their people. When David, who had been overlooked by Samuel and his daddy, rejected, got together with his rock and his slingshot, Goliath fell. And the paper read the next morning, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. When 3 Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and a bad Negro that were rejected, went in the fiery furnace, when God got a hold of them, they calmed the fire down. The truth is, whenever the rejected have come together, on the day of Pentecost, the rejected came together, and God sent power, and they challenged his Herod so bad, they said, these people are turning the world upside down. During slavery, it looked like justice had lost, but when the rejected, like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and some Quakers and white evangelists got together, they changed this country. It looked like Jim Crow had beaten justice down, but when the rejected, like Rosa Parks and Fred Shuttleworth and Martin Luther King and Rabbi Heschel, a rejected Jew, and Barrett Ruster, rejected because he was gay, and James Reed, rejected because he was a Unitarian, and Viola Woosa, rejected because she was a white woman. When they all got together, they brought Jim Crow down. Apartheid in South Africa looked invincible. But when Nelson Mandela, who was born rejected, got together with the rejected black mothers of South Africa, and they got together with Bishop Tutu, and he got together with Peter Story of the Methodists, when they all got together, they tore apartheid down. When women were rejected, and they didn't have the right to vote, Sojourner Truth, rejected. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, rejected. Lucretia Mott, rejected. But when they got together, they won the right to win, the right to vote. Plessy versus Ferguson looked like it had the day, separate but equal forever. But when Thurgood Marshall, a rejected lawyer, got together with some Jewish lawyers and some white lawyers, they were able to win in the Supreme Court and tear Plessy versus Ferguson down. And some years ago, they told me I'd never walk again. I was in a wheelchair. I was 30 years old. They said, put up your preaching robe, go home, get you a place in the nursing home. And I went in depression, but I'm here to tell you, when my faith got together, and the doctors got together, and my children got together, and the prayer warriors got together, and the nurses got together, and my swim coat got together, I can walk now. I can outlive anybody in here standing for justice, because when we all get together, what a day! 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 Don't be satisfied. Get together and change this world for the better. God bless you. Did y'all do that texting? Yes. All right. I hope y'all gonna take me up on my offer. They'll be here in about 3 weeks. Around the first week in March, people gonna start coming down here. And y'all need to say something. You can't keep coming to my home disrespecting me. All right, now I'm not telling you to riot, I'm not telling you to be an insurrection, I'm telling you to be a resurrection. Huh? Not telling you to cuss nobody, but just speak the truth. Because you know it don't make no sense. Huh? To keep coming down here talking about we love this and we love that, and then when you look at the voting record, everything Dr. King and others stood for, you diametrically opposed to it. You know what that's called in the Bible? Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. And it's got to start. So much has started in Alabama, and it's got to start again. It's got to start again, and then we've got to join you. Any questions?
Here's your opportunity.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, Brother Dr. Reverend Barber.
Thank you, sir.
As an educator, one of the things I've spent the majority of my life doing is inspiring students to get more heavily involved in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And as you know, this city, many cities like Birmingham, were built on new technologies.
That's right.
Like steel.
That's right.
And we saw with the greed that was tied to the production of steel, that led to a lot of people living their lives in poverty.
That's right.
In the state of Alabama, Pittsburgh, and we could go across the country. What would you say to our students here tonight who are working on degrees, but particularly those going into the science and the technology and the engineering industries, the third revolution that's occurring in this country? What would you inspire them to do? Not just to learn the technology and make money, but what do you do with that knowledge?
That's a powerful question. What do you do with all of this new knowledge? And so, there's a quote from Francis Bacon, I think it was, who said, "Knowledge is not a place from where you stand to look down on the rest of humankind, but it is a position from which you serve." Now, it's interesting to me that a number of the people who were in SNCC were also in STEM before STEM was popular. Bob Moses was a mathematician. Yeah, ended up getting a PhD in math. And so many of, I could name others who were involved in the sciences and the maths, number of the doctors that were part of the civil rights movement. They didn't use their training to opt out. They used their training to get deeper in. We have to be careful today when there are forces, not just Jeff Bezos, the guy out Florida and what he's doing, but Roger Sand. But there's something else bad, is when our children are being trained to get degrees, but not increase the degree of their participation in humanity and in justice. Now, I'm struggling right now with certain HBCUs. I think it's a shame and a disgrace. You can go to an HBCU and don't even have to take Black history. It's not a required subject. One of the reasons we started the center at Yale, and this may be something it's called the Center for Public Policy and Public Theology, and we're bringing students in to wrestle with, what is my moral responsibility with the education and the opportunities that we have? We used to say it like this: you don't just want to be a doctor who gets paid, you want to be a doctor who delivers people from diseases. You don't just want to be a judge that gets a judgeship, you want to be a judge that works on justice. And I think the same is true: science, technology, engineering, math. You mentioned the new sciences. You know, that was one of the reasons, if you go back in the history of Alabama, there was so much fighting against the unions in this state, because the unions at one time were bringing together people of all different race, creeds, and color, and they were benefiting from some of the newest with steel. And there was a whole attempt, there's a whole history about how the very black people, for instance, that were still rights, millwrights, when segregation kicked in and greed kicked in, and they blocked unions, and then they made them train somebody else and moved them to janitors. My children, what I say to them, I have a son who's an environmental physicist, but I made sure that I took him with me around the country, and he decided by being in the presence of the movement that he would not only be an environmental physicist, undergraduate, he would get a law degree and then become an environmental lawyer, and combine the two to fight with and for frontline poor communities. So now he's using his education to actually buy farms across the South and returning those farms, but using the new technology in farming to help reclaim land and uplift poor rural communities. I have a son now that's majored in genetics, biotechnology and genetics. I didn't know he was, I thought he was an artist. He drew all the time. But he decided to combine his ability to freehand draw with his ability in science, and now he's planning on getting a PhD in genetics, but he wants to use that PhD in genetics to particularly study the diseases that affect poor people the most. My daughter graduated from Bennett College and then went on to Harvard, got a PhD in public health, but she decided that her focus would be on looking at poverty in East Africa and Brazil and poverty in America and the outcomes that it has, particularly on the heart, and how that research can be used to help communities that are often underserved, who make up these 87 million people who don't have health care. Because you know, even with the Affordable Care Act, 31 million people still don't have health care, and some 13 million African Americans. And so she just founded the Mbutu Center at Drexel University. So there are a lot of models, and my father, this is the way my father taught me, and I want to encourage you. And you don't have to be a child's father, you can be a father figure. When I was preparing to go off to college, and the story is my father left middle class income, went back home to Eastern North Carolina to help fight in the Civil Rights Movement. He was so moved after '63 when I was born. And he went back home to stand alongside of workers who weren't being paid a living wage, weren't being labor rights, and you know, desegregation of our schools didn't happen until the 1970s. He went back to be a part of it. He came back to the South from Indiana. He already had, you know, they had voting rights in Indiana and some form of desegregation. But he brought his only child back to the South in '64, knowing that I would have to go to segregated public schools. But that was their commitment to the movement. But when I became college age and was about to go off to college, he called me one day out of the house. And when I got out there, he had a circle of people there. Now, I don't know if in Birmingham, because I know you all are, cityfied up here, but out in the country, folk have nicknames like Baby Ruth, and Mama Jane, and all like that. And so he had a group of those folk out in the yard, and he put me in the middle of them. And he made me look at them. And he said, "You owe." He said, first thing is you owe all these people who are just as brilliant as you, they just didn't get the opportunity. And you owe to go off to school and not to forget that you're going to school for more than just a job. You're going to school so you can make a contribution to a life, and a life making a difference in the lives of others. And then he said, you owe God, because you have a mind that's greater than any computer and you didn't pay a dime for it. You have a thumb that separates you from a primate, which allows you to hold a scalpel and operate on somebody, and a primate can't do that even though they have 4 fingers. You owe. And I think that we have to put that onus upon young people today. You owe. And it doesn't have to be a negative, it's a positive. You owe. And whatever field you are going into, the question should be, what's going to be your living? What's going to be your living? There's a story, I'll close here, about a guy who was a physicist and an engineer. And he was at one of the big schools. He happened to be from Africa. And he was there in a meeting one day. And some of the other professors saw him come in. So one guy who happened to be white went over to him and says, "What do you do for a living?" And he said, "I'm a Christian." So the guy went back to his friend and said, "You know, that's the problem with bringing these people over here. They don't know our language. They don't understand English. And so, and they're just bad." He said, "Let me try again." He said, "What do you do for a living?" And the guy said, "Oh, you talking to me? Oh, I understood your question. You did not understand your question. I think that what you are suggesting is, what do I do for a job? For a job, I've just been hired to be the chairman of your department." "And so I expect to see you early Monday morning, that we might have a conference about your relationship and how you appreciate diversity. But for a living, I'm a Christian. For a living, I'm committed to justice. For a living, I try to do everything I can to promote the way of love. It is not that I did not understand your question. You did not understand what you were asking."
Yes, I'm an old VA nurse with a husband buried at the Veterans Memorial Cemetery. And I have a question. Does anyone in this room know who the veterans, who the VIPs are? They're Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. They join together to watch each other's backs because they are retired from our intelligence community. And they try to tell a story that what goes on when we try to have diplomacy and other things besides war. And I want to know why the budget is always okay when it comes to destruction and killing, but it's not okay when the opposite needs are being met, and why we continue to use our veterans in this way. There's so many ways we could use our veterans without war being the answer.
Yeah. Well, you know, you're exactly right. And one of the problems that I think is so major is because, why did Dr. King march and push and visit and go? He was trying to make America see herself. You know, why is it that people poured out so much when the young brother fell out and on the football field? And, you know, I did a national prayer for the players and whatnot. Hamlet. Because people saw it and they kept seeing it over and over again. Why is it that people are concerned about people in Ukraine? Because they keep seeing it. The problem is that so much of our media presentation doesn't do that with the issues of poverty and denial of health care and people dying, the lack of those things. Very seldom do you hear it. Hardly ever in our political debates. When the last time you heard a presidential debate on poverty? And if you get elected to be president, how are you going to address these issues? These things are pushed to the margin, which is why you have to have a movement that refuses to allow that to happen. Right? A movement that says, no, you're not going to drown us out, and you're not going to push us into the margins, number one. Number two is oftentimes, my sister said, that debate is not held. You know, right now, even before this last gross expanse of our military budget, the military budget we already had, even under Trump, if you cut it in half, we would still have more money in our military budget than Russia, China, North Korea, Iraq, and Iran combined. Combined. But if you read things like the Wall Street Journal, whenever there's increased money to militarism, they always argue that if you vote against it, you're voting against our safety. And what's often happening is the counter is not given, that when you vote for this and you spend 54 cents of every discretionary dollar on the war economy, because most of the money doesn't go to the veterans, it goes to the war economy. It goes to the military manufacturers. One military contract for 1 year at Boeing could pay for every state that is denied Medicaid expansion. And so, but we don't hear that. So the counter is not put out there that in fact, by keeping this military-industrial complex, which, by the way, even a general like Eisenhower said you had to stop. Dwight Eisenhower, of all people, not Dr. King, Dwight Eisenhower said that you had to put a control on what he called the Congressional Military-Industrial Complex. And so this is why we have to have a moral revival and a moral movement. Many of the people that claim they love veterans, like right here in this state, there are thousands of veterans or people formerly connected to the military that would qualify for Medicaid expansion, but your state legislature refused to pass it. But I bet you, no candidate that has run against the people that are blocking Medicaid expansion has put that in their face and made that a major news story, or the news has pointed that out. I bet you they don't talk about the number of veterans in this state who make less than $30,000 a year. So there's a lot of hypocrisy out here about we love the veterans, when in reality what folk is they love the military-industrial complex. This is why, at the very least, we can't be satisfied, silent, or out of the way. This is why we have to constantly be a movement. This is why we're building coalitions around the country. Now, I'm not naive to suggest that this is easy. It is easy to be done. It's not easy to get done. I mean, we know exactly what to do. There's no scarcity of resources or scarcity of policy issues, but when you have a scarcity of moral consciousness, and when you take on systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, and the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, you are taking on interlocking injustices that do not intend to be disturbed. But again, the tradition of Dr. King is not you stand up if you know you're going to win. You stand up because not standing up is too great of a burden to lose. It's like in the book of Ezekiel, God told the prophet Ezekiel, he says, look, I'm sending you to a stiff-necked people. And they may not change, but at least they will know there has been a prophet among them. Amos in chapter 5 of Amos said, God says, I need a remnant that will act like something is wrong. Read it in the Message Bible, Amos chapter 5. I need a group of people that will at least cry, that would at least scream, that would at least say, not on my watch. And then it says, and God said, if I could just hear a remnant, I don't need to hear everybody. If I could hear a remnant, I would help you. But I need somebody that at least say, we cannot keep having religious celebration while justice is not rolling down like waters and righteousness is not like a mighty stream. But then lastly, I want you all to hear me very carefully on this. My sister asked a question. Extremism in this country is not winning because it's so powerful. It's winning because too often we've left the field. Bishop Tutu once said in the midst of South Africa's fight, he said, oftentimes a dying mule kicks the hardest. People would not be fighting so hard to keep us apart. I think I told Carolyn one time, I've been surprised really going across the country how many times I've gotten death threats and things for talking about health care. And then I thought about it one day. I said, you know, people wouldn't be fighting us so hard if we were weak. I mean, if, you know, at some point you have to, you have to understand that your enemy is telling you how strong you are. The question is, are you learning the lesson? The enemy wouldn't be, if you have to lie and select a president that lies every other second and pass laws that put hundreds of billions of dollars of mystery money into politics in order to control it, and then you've got to block voting rights and attack gay people and attack trans people and attack Latino people and attack women, that's not a sign that you're strong. That's a sign that you're weak and scared. The issue is, are we going to be smart enough to come together? Because they are cynical enough to be together. And if we would be smart enough to come together, we might win some of them over. But right now, the South is not red. The South is unorganized. The South is too many places where people are sitting out. There's not a state in the South where if just 25% of poor and low wealth people who don't vote would mobilize, that they could, but too many of our folk keep listening to the lie. And then sometimes we re-endorse the lie. Let me make somebody mad and I'm going home. And sometimes that happens from the black church. Oh, wow. Because you know that's who kicked King out too, right? Y'all do know that. King got kicked out of his own denomination. Let's don't miss over that now. He was kicked out. But, you know, I go around sometime and I had somebody one time and was in a black, so-called, I don't like to say black denomination, but denomination happy. Well, Reverend Bob, you know, we would join the campaign, but you keep letting the gay folk in. And I said, what? I said, you embrace the gay folk. I said, you do too. Go to your choir. Choir. Go down the history of your family. I said, you ate in a restaurant this morning. Did you ask the waiter, was he gay? When people come through the church to put money, do you have an usher standing there, who you sleep with last night? You wouldn't do that. You quote Langston Hughes, you do know he was gay, right? Uh-oh. Y'all didn't know that? Mother to son? Huh? Bayard Rustin, who organized the March on Washington? Gay. Laureen Hansberry? And how y'all be celebrating Medea and then don't want no gay folk in the church? Come on, y'all, crazy. And why are you so upset about who's sleeping with who while somebody's taking your health care, taking your living wages? Come on now. I told a preacher one time, he said, Doc, I don't get into all that political stuff. I said, but you get into pastors' anniversaries. And you want people to give you some money. How sick do you think it is that you ask people to give money for your pastor's anniversary, but you won't fight for them to have a living wage? And then on the other side, we got too many brothers and sisters in our white church that's so scared they're going to get put out of the church. They're so scared to preach the truth sometimes. Just, whew. And like King found here in Birmingham, they keep saying, well, let's go talk to him. Let's just take it easy. Did you know that the Pew Foundation did a study of 50,000 sermons in the American pulpit? And by the way, you ought to read this book called One Nation Under God, The Purchasing of the American Pulpit. It traces how the American pulpit, after the New Deal in 1930, was purchased by the Sun Oil and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, U.S. manufacturers, a whole history of it. They actually bought pulpits and preachers and trained them how to preach a false form of Calvinism. It basically says if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. So if you're good, you're going to be middle class. If you're bad, you're going to be poor. And when y'all hear that old prosperity stuff now in church, you jump 3 times, turn around, if you got faith, you're going to be wealthy. That's not even biblical. But anyway, back to what I was saying. What was I saying? So, what was the point? Yeah, it was a good one. 50,000 sermons. They studied 50,000 sermons. Remember, never forget Dr. King was a pastor. Don't ever have a King remembrance and a reconsecration and leave that out. Even if you're not a believer, you got to at least deal with that. He wasn't against people who didn't believe like he believed, but you can't take that away. He was a pastor. And you can be a pastor and welcome all people because Jesus did that. He said, I have others who are not of this fold, right? But 50,000 sermons, they studied them. What was being preached in the American pulpit? Poverty did not register as a sermon topic. Y'all did not register. Now, how to be baptized registered. Hallelujah and amen registered. But the thing that Jesus talked about the most didn't register. In the Bible, the number one sin in the Bible is idolatry, self-worship. The second sin is mistreatment of the least of these, the poor, the women, the children. And if you cut all the scriptures in the Bible out that have to do with that, the Bible falls apart. But if in the American pulpit, what Jesus talked about most doesn't even register, then all the problem is not out there. It's a problem of consciousness. As the pulpits of this country, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, are not shaping consciousness. Just like in the 1800s, there was a civil war in the church before there was a civil war in the nation. The church split in the 1830s and 1840s, and then the nation split. And so when I met with Philip Austin, who's the special rapporteur of the UN on poverty, he said to me, Bishop, I'm not necessarily a person of faith, but I know a God-sized problem when I see one. If there's a God, I know there's a God-sized problem. He said, because we don't have a problem of scarcity. That's a lie. $22 trillion budget, you don't have a problem with scarcity. We don't have a problem with scarcity of ideas. He said, we have a scarcity of consciousness. We have what Otto Schwammer calls attention violence. And he said, and that's your job. And if those of you who claim faith, or claim just to be moral agents, you claim to believe in the moral arc of the universe, if you're satisfied and not fighting for a moral revival, then you can't just blame the extremists. You have to also confess your own satisfaction. That's why I'm putting it to you real serious, Alabama. Real serious. I love you. We need you. You can't let another Bloody Sunday and Civil Rights Tour go by where these folk come down here and they don't even get asked, where did you stand last year on the voting right? Where did you stand? And they get to sit in churches on Sunday morning, come over there to the museum and all that stuff. And they know and talk about how great the civil rights movement was, and they at least ought to be challenged. They at least ought to have to see you. When the bus drives in, there at least ought to be 1,000 of y'all on the street saying, if you can't pass voting right, turn around. I mean, really. Because I said over to the museum, and I'll stop here. I think it was Nora Hurston. I think it was her. She said, if folk are killing you and you don't say anything, I'm paraphrasing, they will kill you and then report that you enjoyed it. Finally, you know, Dr. King was killed, as we said. He didn't just die. And I think every now and then we ought to wrestle with the issue of death openly, not just at funerals. So can I wrestle a little bit with the issue of death? You know, if COVID should have taught us anything, it should have taught us we don't have any breath to waste. We ain't got but one life to live, and all of us are 6 minutes from death. Because if any of us can't breathe for 6 minutes, most doctors said that's pretty much it. You might make it, but. So during COVID, one day, I really got it bad because we got a report that one of our members of the Poor People's Campaign in Mississippi lost 25 members of her family within a 2-mile radius. And she called me. And she said, Bishop, I got to stay in this movement because I don't have nobody now. And we were getting ready to do a march, and she called me to ask permission to march on the front. And I said, baby, but you heard it. She said, I can't do this without my family. And the only thing that keeps me sane is knowing that we're standing up for what's right. In my own church, one family lost 12 members. And one day I was sitting down, because I have immune deficiencies. And my doctor had told me if I caught COVID before the vaccines, it probably would go rough. And I started thinking about it, though. I know I've been around COVID. I knew I had before the vaccine. I'm a pastor, I've been there. I know. And one day it got real heavy on me. Why am I still alive? I mean, this baby lost 25 family members, and some of them were young. You know, why? I mean, I got to feeling real bad about that. Like, why am I still alive? And over in the night, the Spirit says, that is always the wrong question. Because none of us know why. Through many dangers. Toils and snares, we've already come. David said we're but a step from death. So the question really never is, why are you still alive? Dr. King said, if you ain't found something to die for, you ain't really living no way. The question is, what are you going to do with the life you have? It's never why are you still alive. You can't figure that out. You've been through dangers seen and unseen. But the question of life is what am I going to do with the breath I have? If 6 minutes, 16 minutes, 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, or 60 more years. And one thing we ought to learn from COVID is breath is too powerful to waste. If we're going to use it, we ought to use it speaking up for justice. We ought to use it speaking up for love. We ought to use it working for what's right. We ought to use it trying to make this world better. So when the day comes that breath is no more, somebody, along with God, will be able to say, well done. I believe that all of y'all are still living so that when these folk come down here in 2 weeks, y'all not going to waste your breath no more. And they're going to see a throng of folk. Y'all tell the folks, send it over to Alabama. We ought to have a mass sit-in on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and then take it right on to D.C. It's been 10 years since the Voting Rights Act was gutted. It's been 13 years since the minimum wage. Enough. And I don't know if I'm going to live to see it changed. But I know this, I'm not going to waste no breath on foolish stuff. And I know, and I believe the promise of God, that when the stones that the builders reject come together, we can be the cornerstone of a brand new society. We had a first Reconstruction. It was killed, hung, and assassinated. We had a second Reconstruction. It was killed, hung. It is time for us now in this country to have a third Reconstruction and work on finishing what has not yet been finished. God bless you all. I love you.
And I serve as Assistant Vice President for Campus and Community Engagement at UAB in the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I would first like to thank Dr. Barber for coming and giving that amazing message. This event was really our culminating event at UAB for our annual King Week. And it wouldn't have been possible. I want to make sure that I am recognized wants to recognize the staff in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for always working so hard behind the scenes to make sure we're able to do events like this. Secondly, I want to recognize our partners, Dr. Tina Kempen-Reuter with the Institute for Human Rights helped to support this event, her in her office. Dr. Samantha Briggs and the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. I want to make sure I recognize them as well. And I also want to recognize UAB's Division for Student Affairs. They were also a partner with this event. And I want to recognize the city of Birmingham for coming out. This was something that we really wanted to do in terms of building more connections with the community. And I'm definitely pleased to see you all come out tonight. And thank you to 16th Street Baptist Church as well. What an honor it is to be in this place. Reverend Price and Valerie Lee have worked tirelessly to make sure that they were accommodating our guests and be accommodating to Reverend Barber. And last, I want to thank our UAB Gospel Choir. And they're going to play us out. And so, again, thank you all for coming out, and we'll see you next time.